Good morning on the East Coast. I'm Joshua Walker at Japan Society. Thank you for spending your morning. Hopefully you're like me and have your caffeine ready to go. We've got a really exciting and a topic that does not need caffeination. 5G, the next generation of mobile network, and what this might mean for U.S. Japan cooperation. And we have an all-star panel to deliver verdicts and insights from across the world, ranging from the U.S. and Japan, even including Europe, given where some of our panelists are going to be coming from. My job is to simply say thank you to our sponsors of this, which are our business and policy program with the Mizuho Financial, Toyota North America, and of course, Citi and Deloitte, who are always there with us. But let me turn this over to our expert panelist who knows more than anybody else on these topics. Let me turn it over to Dr. Nicol Turner-Lee, who's a senior fellow of governance studies and director for the Center for Technology Innovation, who's quite an expert on Zoom these days from Brookings. So Dr. Turner-Lee, let me turn it over to you. Thank you for joining us, and thanks to all the panelists, and thank you, the audience, for joining us. There will be a time for Q&A at the end, but I hope you get a chance to learn as much as I look forward to. Nicole?
Thank you, Josh. I really appreciate it. And a special thank you to the Japan Society for involving me. As it was said, I'm Nicol Turner-Lee. I am a senior fellow in governance studies and the director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution. And I'm really excited to actually facilitate this conversation for a couple of reasons. It's no secret that 5G is rapidly changing the nature of how we communicate. And these advanced technologies are going to be the promise of not just commercial use, but they will ultimately determine our ability to get access to public goods and services like telehealth, like education, like accessing, precision agriculture, and the list goes on. But as I've written in several papers, this technology has a suite of questions that we should still answer. Answer for consumers, answer for businesses, and answer for governments. And so I'm really excited today to talk about 5G from the context of its use cases and its utilization, but also from the context of foreign relations. What does it look like with Japan? How do we actually think about the Chinese relationship around 5G, particularly what we have seen in this last administration? And how do we envision the future of mobile technology that advances very creative solutions, some of which we have not yet even imagined? With that, I'm really excited today to be joined by a very distinguished group of panelists. I'm more excited that you can actually see it on my face at this early morning hour or this afternoon hour. And those folks include Muriel Médard, who is the Cecil H. Green Professor in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. We are also joined by Yuka Koshino, who is a research fellow for Japanese security and defense policy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Elsa Kania, Kania, and I just practiced it, Elsa, who is the Adjunct Senior Fellow, and I actually know her from her work at Brookings as well, in Technology and National Security Program for the Center for New American Security. And last, and certainly not least, is Kazuo Naguchi, who is the Senior Manager of Cybersecurity Team Research and Development Division at Hitachi America, Ltd. So thank you, panelists, for getting up with us this morning for the Japan Society to have this important conversation. I want to begin before we delve into questions. And for those of you that are watching, please remember to write down any questions that you may have. We will take those at some point in the program. But let's start, and Muriel, will start with you. I'd like to actually ask this question that I don't often get to ask people, particularly when we have international friends. Why are we touting this new technology? What is the purpose and what is the meaning that makes 5G technology just so incredibly different and special at this time?
Yes, thank you very much. And again, thank you for having invited me as part of this panel. I'm really looking forward to it. So as you mentioned, my name is Muriel Médard, and I lead the Network Coding and Reliable Communications research group in the Research Lab for Electronics at MIT. And I hold the Cecil H. Green Chair in the Electrical Engineering and Computer Science Department. And I've been working in areas of communications, particularly wireless communications, but also reliability, security, low delay communications for many years. So for me, it has been super exciting, really, to have this theme become so topical. I think that one of the things I like to always make sure that we distinguish, and let me go ahead and maybe share my slides here. I just have one slide, so do not worry. Let me see if I am sharing the correct slide. Is that, there is a formal definition of 5G, and there is also an informal definition of 5G. And I think the reason people are so excited is because of the informal definition of 5G, which is, in effect, a network such as you see here in this scary picture on the right, which is integrating everything. It's integrating the cloud, it's integrating what we call the fog, which is the cloud at the edge. It's integrating storage, it's integrating different types of networks. And I think one of the really important things to remember is that usually 5G is considered to be a set of standards which are associated with a body, 3GPP, even though it's officially not exactly a standardization body that's done by the ITU, strictly speaking. It is de facto a closed set of industry players who get together and make certain decisions. But informally, it has really become more an enabler, which is for the first time, and I think that that's going back to your question, Nicole, what's different? I have a phone here. I can make phone calls and I can watch YouTube videos of cats. So what else could I possibly want? I can even make Zoom calls. The difference is that there's a desire, to have very low latency systems. That is to say, enabling different types of applications, such as, for instance, haptic applications, which require extremely low reaction times. B, there's this idea that I should be able to use all the spectrum out there. And it's very clear with 5G that, in effect, it has acknowledged that Wi-Fi is a huge part of it. That is to say, if you look at already 4G, and I think this has become starkly clear to many of us right now working from home, everything's being carried by Wi-Fi. Excuse me, it doesn't mean that you're not using the say the 4G network, but even very often when you're paying your provider a monthly fee, really what they're doing is they're connecting you to your own Wi-Fi, for which you're paying separately. So it's an interesting arrangement. It's clear in 5G that there's already, for the first time, a chunk of reserved in the standards, just at least a placeholder for these basically non-standard elements. The standards themselves are very heterogeneous. Rather than seeing, most of the services be at the sort of, generally most desirable carrier frequencies at around, say, 2.5 gigahertz and so on. Probably in Japan, you're looking more at 3.5 gigahertz. And also in Europe, that tends to be like, the workhorse. You're seeing now services being offered at, frequencies that we hadn't used in, heavily commercially in ages, like 600 megahertz for rural area. In extreme areas, urban areas, particularly in Japan. Actually, I was recently on a panel on 6G, and one of my Japanese colleagues was saying that they're rolling out a 28 gigahertz. That's so high, it makes your head spin.
Yeah.
But it now becomes a hodgepodge. And, a lot of my work is actually, how do you take this hodgepodge of different networks and make them look synthetically through mathematical means, which is what network coding does. In particular, I work on random linear network coding, which so far is the only approach that we know will actually work. How do you make all these disparate pieces actually work together?
Yeah, and Muriel, we'll actually talk about that during the panel. So I don't want you to go, I want you to wait till some of the questions, because if not,
absolutely,
we'll give everything. But I agree with you. What we're seeing is a lot of this coordination of the network design will enable a host of other functions. Yuka, I want to turn to you in terms of your role in the research that you do, and just sort of pivot to the same question real briefly. You know, why do you think we're touting this new technology at this particular time?
Right. So thank you, Nicole, and hi everyone. I'm Yuka, and so I'm currently based in London. I work for the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and so, but until the end of last year, I was based in DC. So I hope to bring in some policy perspective to this conversation today, from the perspective of looking at 5G policies in Japan, the United States, and UK, and some European countries. So I think that I wanted to raise 3 points in my opening remarks. So first, why 5G is so important. Probably in the technical aspect, Muriel gave us explanations about some features, including low latency and massive connections, not just to smartphone devices, but also with IoT devices, which really brings the difference between 4G and 5G, and allows some industrial applications like remote medicine or smart manufacturing, smart agriculture. In the Japan context, these are critical for future economic growth, as the population is facing decline and aging society is shrinking the labor population. So from the Japan context, it has significant economic implications. So that is why the rollout has been very much gaining a lot of attention. Other 2 points I wanted to raise was from the national security perspective. One of why the 5G has become such a buzzword in the United States, in Japan, and across the world is the fact that the vendor diversity, the lack of vendor diversity in the current market. So if you look at the 5G base station and the radio access network market, you can only see a handful of suppliers like Nokia, Ericsson, Huawei, ZTE, Samsung, and some Japanese companies, which is has in terms of global market share less than 1%. And the largest market share, there's a large market share by Chinese vendors, which is considered as high risk vendors from many countries. So the fact that, especially in the U.S. perspective, the company that has the largest share in the market is a strategic competitor raises a lot of geopolitical questions. And then another third aspect that I wanted to raise was that 5G is really spurring debate about how we think about adding competition to the market and adding vendor diversity. And this has been emerged over the last several years, but very quickly over the past year, especially because many countries have become more serious about the security concerns of 5G and how they can ensure cybersecurity and vendor diversity in their market. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, that's such an interesting point that for all of the panelists will definitely pick up, because I think in the United States, we've actually dealt with that as we think about the next iteration of 5G networks in terms of infrastructure. So I think your points are right on, and it ties on to what Muriel's talking about, which is this complexity in its design. Elsa, I'll turn to you because I know you want to extend on policy as well. Where are we? Why are we touting this? And I know you and I have been on a couple of discussions around this. So give us your perspective.
Absolutely, and just to build on my co-panelists' insightful comments, this is quite an exciting moment to be talking about 5G when you think about the potential and possibilities that this capability will bring into bear. And certainly we're starting to see 5G come to fruition, though from the perspective of potential competitive advantage, it's certainly concerning to me that the US has lagged behind relative to the opportunities in this space, certainly when it comes to moving forward towards leveraging applications of 5G. And the pandemic has been an interesting illustration of some of these dynamics. And certainly as someone who comes to this debate from concentrating on innovation, technological development in China. It's been fascinating to see 5G as a case study of the relative successes of China's model in some respects, not necessarily in terms of being at the cutting edge of innovation. Certainly American companies and American research is still pioneering new progress in the space, as are some of the exciting developments coming out of Japanese companies in research. So certainly this is a global and rapidly evolving ecosystem with a great deal of complexity. But when it comes to applications of 5G starting to really take shape within a dynamic industry, and in terms of potential economic significance, China is, by most metrics, really at the forefront of that. And Chinese leaders have committed to accelerating the deployment of 5G since the pandemic, and China's national response to COVID-19 itself featured 5G-enabled robots for delivery and sanitation, and 5G-enabled remote diagnostics to support doctors. And it's certainly going to be a priority going forward as we think about China's 14th five-year plan and recent initiatives to accelerate new type infrastructure, and especially considering the moment we are today in the global economy, facing threats of severe recession and economies struggling to find new sources of growth and dynamism going forward. 5G will be incredibly consequential when it comes to enabling new types of digital economy, enabling applications that we can imagine, whether in healthcare, education, agriculture, or likely applications we can't even envision today. Who would have imagined that we'd be living our lives on Zoom and too much screen time before the advent of 4G and LTE? So I think certainly 5G brings a lot of possibilities into bear, and is also a matter of national consequence when it comes to taking advantage of 5G in terms of the tangible benefits to our societies, especially at a moment when, frankly, I'm horrified to see how many American school children don't even have access to basic internet for connectivity. And I think there is tremendous significance to trying to accelerate investments to make the benefits of such connectivity available, certainly at least getting to a basic level. But I think given the opportunities to really put in place fiber, broadband, and 5G infrastructure going forward, this is something that every country should be looking to leverage, and where the United States in particular, I think there is a sense of urgency and importance for economic reasons. And of course, when it comes to national security, 5G not only brings to bear perhaps new threats and new concerns given this complexity, but also does present opportunities to be leveraged for military applications and by the national security community. So yeah, I think how to balance the risks and benefits, and how to recognize the threats and challenges while taking full advantage of the opportunities is going to be a dynamic topic for conversation today and going forward.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I love the fact that you're bringing up, again, what I started with, these public use cases where having access to faster broadband is just an enabler. But we have to always be concerned about what other use cases are emboldened by this technology that have the potential to weaponize our systems against us. But I think it's such an interesting topic, right? Because this iteration of 5G during a pandemic is probably teaching us about other use cases that we never thought of before. Kazuo, I want to talk to you now, and I want to find out your response to why we are touting this technology. Particularly, I see at Hitachi, I know that there's been a lot that you all have done to advance in this space as well.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Lee. First, I am honored to be here in this panel today with among distinguished speakers. And thank you for inviting me, Japan Society, particularly Dr. Walker. My name is Kazuo Noguchi, Senior Manager of R&D, Hitachi America. Let me make a disclaimer that my opinion is my own, not employers. I'm also the Executive Director of International Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, or INC-COE, as a part of the Keio Universities as a senior researcher. And this is actually the consortium, nonprofit in UK, US, Japan started as the academia and working with the government folks and industry folks. And so that's a part of the my passion to create some community of government industry and academia. And the 5G drew attention when Huawei ban came into the picture from the particularly market dominance and the security threats perspective. And the UK, for instance, I realized that in July, they also joined a ban. Although they said that after 10 years of research at the Huawei Cybersecurity Evaluation Center with GCHQ and the National Cybersecurity Center, because of some trust issue. In the US, I recognized some ongoing facts that, as Dr. Lee, you mentioned that US DoD also spending $600 million for 5G testing for national security perspective and secure 5G. Also in the US, digital decoupling is one of the big issues coming out. And also in the meantime, Cyberspace Solarium Commission report came in March this year. And just recently in November, ICT supply chain, the report came out. Supposed to be very trusted whole supply chain. Japan, on the other hand, 5G became the catalyst and the innovation for the technology area, digital transformation, also the sustainable development goals, or SDG. And the showcasing towards Tokyo Olympics, that's a great moment to go into the 5G as a new technological innovation area. And so far, I recognized also the local 5G is a solid candidate, including remote healthcare and augmented reality, virtual reality, and the agriculture, smart factory, connected car, so on. And super smart city, which is ongoing, Hitachi is also committed. Society 5.0, which is the super smart city, one of the core concept for innovation addressing, Yuka also mentioned, less kids and a lot of elderly people, how to address those fundamental issues using a new technology, 5G, AI, IoT, robotics, and so on. And the satellite is also on the horizon, and the 5G and the 6G and the backhaul as the satellite. And all in all, 5G has some reports said that the $12 trillion global impact, which is significant. Finally, I like to mention that the keeping a trusted relationship is quite important one. Some discussion coming out, security clearance mechanism, particularly U.S. Japan perspective and the government level is critical to get the foundation of national security perspective. And the collaboration in government, industry, academia is key partnership in the multilateral areas. For industry, I also recognized that zero trust architecture concept, which is already published by NIST, and the mutual digital trust, EU, Japan, and the US. Those are quite important initiative going forward. So back to you, Dr. Lee.
Yeah, you brought up some really great points. I can't wait to delve into these questions because I think in terms of the U.S. Japan relationship, we're going to see greater cooperation that we have seen with China based on what Elsa was talking about in terms of Chinese market dominance when it comes to 5G. I want to be sure before we jump into the nuts and bolts around security and the policy implications, as well as the relationship that we'll see develop between the U.S. and Japan, I want to be clear that the people who are listening understand just the difference between 5G and 4G LTE. Muriel, I'll come back to you just for a moment, just to make sure that we have that distinction, because I know in my research, it's often touted that, well, you could maybe do the same things with 4G LTE as before, 5G. Why do we really need 5G to actually do those things? And as an engineer, can you just explain some of the subtle differences in 5G compared to the last version of mobile technologies?
Yes. So let me start out by saying that we all talk about 5G, but let me repeat what I said before. It's not clear that we will need what's currently touted as 5G to get the services I mentioned. So there's a set of desiderata okay, for heterogeneity, for low delay, for ubiquity. It is not clear that it will be the current players, the 3GPP players, and you've talked about who some of those dominant players are going to give that. The usual reason why you have every 10 years a new generation is not necessarily because of the technology at all. It's because we were relying on a basically traditional phone system, and the equipment was basically at the end of its life. Not even necessarily technically, but certainly from a tax perspective, okay? So I think, I don't mean to be cynical, but we really need to think of it in that respect. At the same time, there has been a lot of evolution in Wi-Fi. I'm using Wi-Fi right now. There's no way I could have done this on Wi-Fi 10 years ago. There's no way, even with a pretty good system. And I have a pretty cheapo system at home, okay? So I think that what we need to do is really think of the set, as I said, the informal definition of 5G, which is the next level of integration, and particularly Kazuo mentioned satellites. I think that's going to be extremely important in terms of the coverage and in terms of having a completely different backhaul. That's to say, how you get into the core of the internet. But it is not clear to me that it has to be the traditional 3GPP players where, as you have mentioned, the US's and North America's footprint has certainly decreased, okay? In terms of the security, I really want to point out that it really, again, depends how you're doing it. If you're doing it the old-fashioned way, the phone company, in effect, going to one or two of its suppliers, which remember, the phone company used to be the same one as the equipment manufacturer. That was split everywhere in the US, by Judge Green in the 80s. But then there's still a completely umbilical relationship between the suppliers and the operators. The operators don't do any of the engineering innovation anymore. They just buy from the suppliers. So if you're looking at maintaining that structure, of course you have a horrible problem with security. If instead, and you talked about zero trust, somebody talked about the zero trust aspect. If instead you had to have trusted systems running on top of untrusted networks, and it doesn't matter why you don't trust it. It doesn't matter if because you have a geopolitical concern that, the guy whoever, can produce the stuff in the base station, was working for the intelligence services of a country you don't like, or whether it's just, I'm connecting to the Wi-Fi at my local coffee shop, and I'm pretty sure the coffee shop owner is not exactly updating security software. That's not why I go there. I go there for the coffee. It doesn't matter, that instead having the correct level of structures on top of it. I think that's what's important. And I think the problem there is the closed aspect of 3GPP, which is why you're seeing a lot of effort around Open RAN. Now, Open RAN does not mean that there is no intellectual property possible. It just means that just the operation itself can be done by outside parties. And I think that's where the actual issue is. Mm-hmm. It's not so much around the equipment, are you going to be able to have an open system just so that you can mix and match equipment from different suppliers? If you look at the Wi-Fi, and again, Wi-Fi keeps improving all the time. If you look at the Wi-Fi Alliance, recently they announced you can do roaming with Wi-Fi.
Right. Yeah, and that's so interesting to me. And I want to go to Kazuo first and then Elsa, because I think what you're suggesting and what we've seen overall in this 5G debate is that and Yuka, I got a question for you to actually bring this all together, right? We've seen these disparate aspects of the network that create a variety of vulnerabilities, which is why this whole idea of trust is so significant in 5G network development. Kazuo, speak to us a little bit about where some of those fractures in security, cybersecurity actually present themselves and why that is a main concern. And I'll have Elsa sort of come behind you and really speak to then those geopolitical concerns that we have before we go into the supplier base. Kazuo.
Yes, ultimately 5G is entrance of all the data. On the other hand, end-to-end supply chain is critical. Hardware, software, firmware, all kinds of inside from beginning to the end, whether or not that is secured. But in the past, there are some indication on the threats from the back door that found, particularly in UK. There are significant effort for 5 years to 10 years in GCHQ and so on, in the UK technical perspective, as well as the US. But there are some evidences that there are hacking through 5G. So that's one area. And also the dominance, so that, by Chinese companies, which is part of the national company, the government, industry, and if they are kind of pushed from a policy perspective for the particular country, it's very difficult to refuse by the fact that it's owned as a part of the owner. And also some of the critical technology in the chips are coming from, for instance, Taiwan's semiconductor, and whether or not that is kind of trusted, something open source are built on, we sometimes difficult to prove. Those potential threats and also trusted kind of risk involved in what tolerance level you have. And so those are kind of combined of factors, nation to nation trust, as well as the technical perspective. So zero trust, as mentioned, if there are some suspicious in the data, stop in the middle, if there's a mechanism. So that is by design, it's trusted if something happening. Also the person in the middle, operators, or some people who are using is very weak link. So that's also part of the argument of the trust of the person. So whether or not that person is good, but all in all, secure the data and the secured end-to-end. Those are the part.
Yeah, no, I appreciate those comments, because I often think that people forget, because we get very much engaged with the 5G network infrastructure, the hardware side of it, that we do forget about the software side. Muriel, before I have you jump in, let me just hear from Elsa on what you think that, particularly we started looking at these vulnerabilities. The UK essentially decided and did not go with Huawei because closer to the core, and then they decided to just change their mind overall. The security threats, Elsa, what are they? Let's speak in concrete terms for our audience, and then we'll have Muriel chime in.
So when we talk about 5G, at times there's a tendency to speak in terms of a race. The race is 5G, the rivalry, but...
I'm guilty.
I'm guilty of that as well, but I think what concerns me is that when there's a focus on speed, at times that may come at the expense of security. And as we've been discussing, security is so fundamental and foundational to the viability of 5G going forward. So I'd say that this is more of a marathon and not a marathon with a single course. As we've heard from Muriel, there may be different kinds of 5G. 5G is not a single monolithic technology. It is being used to characterize a range of potential techniques and approaches that may differ or diverge going forward. But I think the shared challenge is that with this greater complexity comes new security threats and concerns that could be more difficult to mitigate. But if done right, 5G could be more secure than the quite insecure systems upon which we're very dependent today. So 5G is not necessarily insecure, but I think the trade-off will be sort of how to get this right. And while I'll defer to technical experts on those fronts, I think as a couple of comments more from a policy perspective, the debate on 5G security has often focused, with good reason, but too intensely or intently, I might worry, on Huawei itself when we're talking about the totality of the ecosystem, about complex supply chains, and certainly having a single company be so dominant, and especially one that may be subject to undue and opaque influence from a government that has demonstrated the intention and capability to weaponize or exploit that kind of access, I think is concerning. And we've seen relatively shoddy security from Huawei's networks and products in the past. We've seen a lack of transparency about the relationship between Huawei and the Chinese government, and plenty of reasons for concern on that front. But my worry is that when the debate on 5G security is too much about Huawei, we neglect to recognize that simply banning Huawei is hardly enough to actually create or promote security when other vendors, other aspects of 5G infrastructure may remain insecure unless there's a much more holistic, comprehensive, and far-reaching paradigm for how we think about security and at every element of a 5G network for both the software and the hardware, as we're thinking about the data and incorporating greater encryption on all fronts. And yeah, so I think that there certainly are reasons that are of particular concern when it comes to China and Huawei's relative dominance, and ways in which its presence within countries' networks and infrastructures could be exploited in the same way we've seen China exploit economic interdependence and some of its more coercive elements of economic statecraft. But certainly I think the conversation on 5G security, as we're starting to get into it today, does have to be much more holistic in recognizing that there is not a single vector of threat, but multiple reasons for concern. And whether we're talking about standards or best practices in security, there's so much more to so much more to it, but also reasons to recognize that hopefully in 5G we can build upon lessons learned from past failures to have security be more fundamental as a design principle. So I'll stop there for now, but definitely I think a lot of this will come down to risk management and trade-offs, recognizing that there will always be risks, but that doesn't mean that doesn't mean that fear and anxiety about 5G should take over the conversation. We see greater threat vectors with more IoT, with the 5G networks coming into play, but this does not necessarily mean we're moving towards a world of greater insecurity when, as this nascent ecosystem takes shape, there are also reasons to be optimistic about the security benefits 5G could bring going forward.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think you hit it. And I know Muriel wanted to jump in, and then I'll go to Yuka on this question of these vendors. But I agree. I mean, part of the marathon that you refer to is this whole idea of who is going to set the standards around security and set the standards around applications. And I think that's why we're having this conversation today. Muriel, you just wanted to add something to the previous comments that you heard. And then I want to go over to Yuka to talk a little bit about this supplier diversity spat that we are currently.
Yes, and I want to go back to the setting the standards. If you only use the standard as one component, then you will have these problems that you say. I mean, I don't know geopolitically and so on. That's not my area. I'm a technologist. I'm not a political scientist or a policy person. Okay, the problem is. I mean, of course, you could try to secure everything, as Kazuo mentioned, and I don't know if you can do that again. That's not my area. What I'm saying is, if you actually if you did the right thing right now, you use the diversity so that you don't have a single player who can see all your data. They can have backdoors. I don't care. They can have backdoors and it can go straight to, my worst enemy. I don't care, because on top of that, I am doing my coding, which we have actually shown recently is post-quantum secure. And as long as they don't have 100% of my data, they cannot figure it out. Okay, you're making the data protect itself. It can even be that they get 90% of my data, right? As long as that 1% of my data, which by the way, could be coming from, I sound like I'm picking on my local coffee shop. It's a lovely coffee shop. I'm sure they're updating their Wi-Fi all the time. But, I'm taking that as, the example of something local that, has zero security. They don't have their own security person, right? As long as I have multiple of those, I'm okay. And so I think it's more a question as to whether strategically we decide, no, I want to make sure that we don't stay in the legacy system of 4G, 5G, all done through 3GPP. Not that they're not doing some great stuff and we should be able to make use of that technology, but that's not our, end-to-end supply in the traditional way. If we make it so that actually you can use multiple networks, you actually don't have that issue. It's just not there.
Yeah. It seems feasible, I think, from a technical perspective, that you can diversify what those points are and then find some ways to secure different aspects of the network.
It's actually it's not out there. It's not weird. It's not like,
yeah, well, it's weird. It's weird to the policy people.
It might be weird to the policy people, but what I'm saying is it's not, this is not science fiction.
Yes.
So this is a choice as to, do you really want to protect the incumbents and then you're doing things the old way and then you're going to have an end-to-end secure system?
Yeah.
Or do you say, sorry, the horse is bolted. Everybody's most of the time on Wi-Fi anyway. And that's a complete different kettle of fish. People don't think of it as 5G, but it's clear that it's already, most of 4G is Wi-Fi, and it's only going to go up with 5G. Or do you say, okay, this is the way it is. Let me actually, if you give me lemons, make lemonade, and make it diverse so that you have trusted transmission over untrusted networks. And the point there is not to have a single path, but to actually have multiple paths. If you don't code, the more paths you have, the more vulnerable you are. If you do code, the more paths you have, the better off you are. So I think this is a choice of whether to protect incumbents or not.
Right. And I want to go to you, Yuka, because you brought up in your opening remarks around some of these supplier diversity concerns. When the United States aggressively put pressure on Chinese telecom companies in terms of their perceived privacy infractions, we had a world race to who would be the reasonable alternative to companies like Huawei, et cetera, particularly since the low-cost alternative, not just what Muriel's talking about, but it were a low-cost alternative. Some of you don't even realize this. Africa has the highest investment of Huawei equipment, and many countries had to think, well, where do we take it out of the network based on what I think Kazuo and Elsa have talked about in terms of the fragmentation of a variety of systems? How do we actually address, and for those of you that are listening, this is a really important point that I think we're going to bring up in terms of the supplier diversity and this supply chain. You could speak to us a little bit about what do we do if we, in many respects, move China as a key player out of the equation, and where do we find these reasonable alternatives to investing into these network infrastructures?
Right. That's a great question, great points. And I think you made great points about how just simply, also Elsa and Noguchi-san and other panelists have mentioned about just simply banning Huawei doesn't solve this issue on cybersecurity standards or on future ecosystem of the wireless network. So the alternative, in terms of alternatives, the fundamental problem of this approach is that the US or other countries were not really able to offer alternative, cost-effective solutions to other countries. So some of the trends that's going on, one in the industry led kind of effort is to, this is more led by the telecom operators that were looking for a cheaper solution because market diversity does allow the prices to go down. So one example is the industry consortium called the O-RAN Alliance. Now, I think we've been discussing a lot about this new ecosystem and Open RAN, but to make it very simply, Open RAN is so traditionally, the RAN network was provided by a vertically integrated company, which has this proprietary hardware and software component of it, and provides this system. But what Open RAN does is to open up these different components of this system and allow different vendors by adopting the standard interface, same interface standards shared by these other vendors, to come up with a multi-vendor solution. So one of the industry consortium that has been pushing for this effort is called the O-RAN Alliance, which has been started by a handful of telecom operators, including U.S. and Japan, even China Mobile. So it's really about more of bringing innovation, open innovation, and inclusiveness, I think, is the key here. I guess I'll just add, though, that this push on Huawei ban and this concern concern whether you can actually trust this network system provided by companies that has some strong ties with the government through national security laws, for instance, and that requires some Chinese companies to cooperate with Chinese government on intelligence activities, did raise questions. And it's very important this year, especially when the pandemic, and especially when I'm in Europe, I see this discussion changing. In UK, like the conservative politicians have been strongly advocating for the review on its China policy and dependency on Chinese equipment in their telecom network. So because of these push and these pandemic, there's this growing interest in diversification. So not just these industry consortiums and small group of telecoms, but now there's, for instance, 200 telecom operators and vendors together and research institutions in this consortium. So it's becoming a global trend to diversify the network system. I think I'll also raise about what Japan's trying to do. So Japan, I really liked how Noguchi-san phrased, Japan sees 5G as a catalyst for innovation. And it's very interesting to see how the government has been the forefront of this push towards promotion of Open RAN. So I think it's widely recognized that Japan was one of the earliest countries, although there's some criticisms or critiques about how fast the rollout is going. It's happening in Japan in the number of base stations, but the governments are providing, for instance, tax incentives to telecom operators that adopted these open requirements or open technology that are interoperable with international vendors. So that's the requirement for these tax breaks or some kind of loans that these telecom vendors can receive. And if you look at some budget items from last year and this year, you can see that the government, multiple agencies have funded some facilities to make sure that these multi-vendor solutions are interoperable. So these are some efforts that some governments has been stepping up. And we also see some growing efforts like bipartisan bills on the plate in U.S. Congress to invest in this R&D and interoperability between multi-O-RAN solutions. And growing discussions in UK right now, they're trying to put together a diversification strategy by the end of this year. So I'll just probably end there, and probably the panelists can jump in.
Well, what you said is so interesting, right? Because I think in the wake of the type of pressure that we're seeing placed on Chinese telecom companies, that you said the buzzword, which is cooperation and collaboration, particularly in technical design. If you all remember, and I've written this also, Japan is no stranger to the world of mobile technology. In many respects, Japan was responsible for setting that 3G standard. Kazuo, I want to go to you in terms of this cooperation between the US and Japan. We're going to see more of that, given the fact that there has been this type of response to China when it comes to both what Elsa was talking about in their market dominance and their perception of market dominance, as well as the lack of cooperation, potentially, right, as we're seeing with Chinese telecom companies. Would love to see these opportunities that may exist with Japan.
Yes, thank you for mentioning. So the Japan is a latecomer for 5G, and definitely compared with the China. And there are some other the focuses coming out, but in reality, as a whole ecosystem, Japan focuses the like elderly or some economic activities after World War II, not the security or national security area. On the other hand, US has very strong that the DoD, the internet, for instance, started from DoD. So but by nation, it's different focuses for the technology adoption for the commercial use. In the US-Japan perspective, it's complementary in a sense. Now I recognize, as I mentioned, the local 5G effort, meaning adapting for the factory automation, because of the fact that less workforce are recognized in Japan, less younger people, more elderly people, and the farmers, they need workers. Maybe not nursing home, they need to help those robotics and 5G using as the precise kind of help or quasi-human type going forward. So those technology focus in Japan is a very good one. But in terms of the mindset of the security, mindset of how to defend, so from a historical perspective, educational perspective, kind of lacking. So it's a really complementary in the US and Japan. But certainly to get the trust relationship, as mentioned, the security clearance, which is the related to the 5 Eyes relationship. The primary question you mentioned that like Huawei ban, which country and so on, and also really trusted in the national security level. Japan needs to join some level to communicate for the critical decision making. So clearly, how to get the mechanism of the security clearance, how to share in the trusted communication beyond commercial or person to person as a systematic way. And the zero trust I also mentioned should be incorporated. But here's the thing: the critical infrastructure are provided by companies like Hitachi. It's not military, but so the definition of the cooperation should be defined. For instance, the U.S. Japan digital the agreement, digital trade agreement, has the sort of the law. However, how to get the mechanism and the technology behind the support, those needs to happen for getting the trust, not just the low level, but a technical level and a real communication level. So those are the part that I think needed to be addressed and implemented. Let me stop here.
I think that's interesting, because I think we have not thought about the other allies that the United States should have as they try to sort of do what Yuka talked about, sort of switching to a market diversification strategy, but also trying to negotiate, I think, some of those safety measures that really will reduce, I think, the levels of national insecurities within these systems. Elsa, when you think about U.S. and Japan cooperation, and I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot. I didn't ask this question, and I don't know why I didn't think of it as a researcher. We are going into a new president-elect under the Biden administration, and I'm curious the extent to which you will see this new administration begin to sort of shift the tables on our dealings with Asia, particularly looking at cooperative models, if China doesn't want to come to the table, and sort of, figure out ways to become much more collaborative in these networks.
Great question, and I would say, irregardless of administrations and beyond politics, I think there is an increase in consensus in U.S. policy debates on 5G about the critical importance of collaboration, trying to build partnerships with our allies and with a range of like-minded countries on 5G. And encouragingly, some of this kind of collaboration is already starting to take shape, including through the initial conference on 5G security that was hosted out of Prague, and some of the growing consensus on basic principles of 5G security. And I think the impetus for a greater convergence on these fronts comes out of a recognition of the stakes, that 5G security isn't simply a concern of data security or espionage. We're talking about the future of critical infrastructure that will be at the foundation of our societies, and for which an attack or damage could be devastating, especially if 5G starts to become more closely integrated into future smart cities, or into our transportation, into the functioning of our healthcare system and otherwise. So yeah, I think certainly I think there is likely to be a pivot, and at the very least a change in tone and priorities with the new administration. But I think that encouragingly, there already are starting to be more bilateral and multilateral conversations about about developing principles on 5G security, thinking about best practices and lessons learned. And some of these have been perhaps too abstract and not technical enough at this stage, of sort of, for instance, general frameworks to evaluate vendors that are more likely to be risky as a result of, for instance, undue influence by a government that has likely intent and capability to exploit that, whether for espionage or attacks and disruption. But I think going forward, a recognition of the values of an open approach, of concentrating on resilience as a core principle, I think will be critical, and hopefully policymakers and technical experts in the space can continue to coordinate and work towards better understanding of what is a feasible pathway forward on these fronts. And yeah, I think definitely 5G has been highlighted as an industry of the future by the Trump administration. I think President-elect Biden certainly has highlighted the importance of innovation and investments in infrastructure. So there may be some continuity, but hopefully also a continued progression towards a more coherent approach, and also one that concentrates on and builds upon the growing consensus that there needs to be an investment in this critical infrastructure at home as well to start. And hopefully, as we also think about the global elements of the 5G marathon, so to speak, there will be opportunities to promote collaboration, not just in data security and cybersecurity or in research and development, but on providing more feasible and affordable alternatives to countries that might right now turn to Huawei or other vendors that have that fast, cheap option, regardless of their security concerns. And once there are more collaborations for investment and deployment of 5G, bringing to bear the capabilities of different companies and countries in the space, hopefully we might see going forward more of a compelling alternative presented, and more attention to the global development opportunities here as well.
That's right. Just to stay on this policy front, and then Muriel, I have a question on the technical side. And for those of you who are watching, we are going shortly to Q&A. And so I have a list of previously submitted questions, and I've got questions coming through the chat. If you have a question, please be sure to place it within the chat box on the live stream so that I can ask those questions of this very distinguished panel. Yuka, you want to jump in there, and I would love to also hear you say something about who are we not talking about, whether it's the other accelerators in 5G or the laggards personally in 5G. Who else needs to be spoken about as we sort of look at U.S. policy, U.S. Japan policy?
Right. I think I also wanted to build on Elsa's point about after if the president-elect Biden probably has a more multilateral approach and will continue on the ongoing, probably the bilateral dialogues that's been held between the U.S. Japan. So just wanted to highlight some of the developments over the past years between U.S. in Japan. There has been a director level discussions under the U.S. Japan policy cooperation dialogue on internet economy, which has recognized the need for cooperation on trusted and secure and interoperable digital infrastructure in third countries. And then over the past 2 years, it has been recognition of the value for the two countries to cooperate to promote this open network ecosystem. And this latest dialogue that just came and a readout that just came out in September really highlights specifics in how they can cooperate in multilateral standard setting processes or in the Prague conferences, as Elsa just mentioned. So also wanted to highlight on that. And also being the UK, I think in terms of the laggards, it's really great to see lots of discussions on vendor diversity in the United Kingdom, but also for instance, the UK faces challenges that the ongoing discussions for diversification, new ecosystem, when we talk about the new structure of open architecture by disaggregating hardware and software components, the UK doesn't have a strong hardware equipment supplier or software equipment supplier. So they want this open RAN policy and strategy based on open RAN, but has to rely on suppliers like U.S. and Japanese vendors. They've been inviting NEC from the Japan side, like NEC or Rakuten's new communication platform with virtualized RAN, or U.S. Alistar or on Mavenir. But so, and then UK has recognized that. So it's also interesting thing that I'm very interested in watching is this multilateral cooperation under this. I'm sure you've all seen this news from the Times around May, that the proposal of the Democratic 10, which includes the G7 countries, India, South Korea, and Australia, or some new frameworks like T12, some discussions around that, including more cyber countries with cyber capabilities like Israel. But very interesting to see how these new proposals on these multilateral cooperation would be discussed in the new administration.
There's so much going on in this discussion. I almost closed myself out. I apologize. I need 5G, obviously, to have this conversation. I had to throw in one 5G joke. But there's so much in this conversation, and I do agree with you. I think we're seeing so much more conformity and so much more of a push to try to figure out where are those areas that we could actually collaborate. But one thing that we haven't talked about in this conversation, and Muriel, I want to come back over to you, is that 5G is not going to get to everybody. And there will be some exacerbated digital gaps. I mean, as Elsa mentioned, in this country, we're seeing 50 million school-age kids that did not, were sent home, 15 to 16 without broadband access in the home. 5G is going to be the same way. This is not necessarily because we are in an accelerated digital economy because of the pandemic that we're going to turn on the switch and everybody's going to have 5G. I would first love to hear from you. I mean, what are developing countries doing to sort of look at these technology gaps that are being created by the lack of access to these more advanced and more robust technologies?
That's a very good question, Nicole. So a lot of developing countries actually are turning to Wi-Fi, okay? Because again, it's there, it's much cheaper, and it does pretty well. And in some cases, you actually get a fairly good infrastructure just through Wi-Fi connections. It's also something that we see for price competition in the US. I would say probably started more in Europe, sort of free in France is probably the poster child of that, where basically just using the set-top boxes of individual users who obtain some sort of benefit from allowing their spare Wi-Fi capacity to be used. They basically were able to provide a free service. I mean, they bought, just because for regulatory reasons they had to buy a few base stations, they went ahead and did that, but just the a risible small number just so that they could be a phone company. I mean, you see this working out in the New York, New Jersey area, right? With some companies trying to prevent other companies from saying that they're phone companies because they're only using Wi-Fi. I think satellite, as I mentioned before, is going to be very important. Some of my own research on the very much we work in nonprofit with collaborators in Denmark and also in New Zealand to provide service to underserved Pacific Islands, using existing satellite systems, which are very expensive to just rent, and we do coding so that they can get better service. So I think it's a hodgepodge. Very often, again, they'll take a combination of old technologies, so that they will buy old technologies, whether again they've been amortized here, but as I said, they work just fine. They've been maybe amortized in other countries, but they work just fine. And they do a lot of Wi-Fi. So I think there's a lot of quite creative things going on there. I just wanted to make a quick comment about policy and ORAN. There is a policy push towards ORAN, but if you look at the engineering reality, even companies that have signed up to ORAN are in effect maintaining it as a very small sliver because it goes against their business interests. I encourage everybody to look at sites like SDX. I'm not going to name companies, but go and look at one of the current SDX. So for SD, software defined. Elsa and Yuka talked about software defined areas. And ORAN takes lumps. this is not just a question of policy going to the companies and companies say, yeah, sure, I'll do that. It's not. There's a big gap very often between the engineering reality and what has been agreed to in terms of policy. I just wanted to bring that up.
I think that that's actually an important piece. And I love the way you also frame what developing countries may actually rely upon if they do not get 5G, which brings me to this other question before we go into Q&A. I'm sitting here right now trying to figure out these Q&A and how we'll actually do that. The Olympics, Kazuo, the Olympics in Tokyo are coming up. And, you know, we saw in the United States that one of the first applications of 5G technologies were at the Super Bowl and other places and very large scale gatherings to ensure the level of connectivity. I'll start with Kazuo, but if anybody would like to answer, there was a question about the Tokyo Olympics and the extent to which 5G will be tested and deployed in Japan and become a use case for the type of ubiquitous deployment that we'd like to see.
Yes, thank you for the question. Reality for me is I'm living in the U.S. and you know, I do not travel to Tokyo these days, so I don't have the very hot information on that. But Olympics, as you may know, is a great timing to push some new things to see in the past Tokyo Olympics. Many things, TVs and transportation started. 5G is part of it for the innovation ecosystem to watch, regardless. So Tokyo 2020 become 2021 will happen. How you can to watch the real the games in reality, virtual reality could be utilized, and so where and which angle. Some people are very keen on the particular the athletes or some game scene repeated, but the 5G is helping those virtual reality or checking through iPhones. Some balls are coming from that angle, you know, with some particular person. So those are enablers, the cases of the games happening as far as I understand. But the transportations and for the people's convenience, the people visiting from all over the world, if everything goes fine, so 5G can enable for the convenience for many things, including robotics and so on. That's a great thing. But how to secure is another thing. From London Olympics to, you know, there are some digitized, but they are also vulnerable, in a sense, how to make sure that these works well from the opening towards the end. So 5G is an enabler for all in all for the touching point for the people.
Yeah, no, I agree. And anybody want to respond as well? Because I think it's going to be a very interesting use case based on the conversation that we're having right now. Anybody else want to respond on the 2021 Olympics? And like you said, if it actually happens, is a whole nother story. But the enablement of 5G in these large scale settings, I think will be a great replication of the future to come. Anyone else?
I'm excited and optimistic that there are now several vaccine candidates. And
yes,
on that point, I'd speak to, I think the importance, if we are going to see a 2021 Olympics, of trying to combat mis and disinformation around 5G and around a vaccine going forward, since these unfortunately are topics upon which there can be a lot of conspiracy theorizing, whereas on both fronts, I think a vaccine will be critical if we're going to move forward as a society, and 5G will be an important in some of these near-term test cases and of long-term consequences as we think about health going forward.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And thank you for bringing that point up, Elsa, because I also think about, when I think about the example that I gave of the Olympics, we spent a lot of time on urban connectivity with 5G. And really, we should be thinking about the seamless nature between using 5G for rural connectivity as well. Just like in the United States, Japan also has huge areas topographically that are very complicated to connect with fiber, but yet we can actually see 5G as one of those game-changing technologies that brings more people in. That's why I like to think of 5G as an inclusive technology. And not sure what what other people think in terms of, again, creating much more continuity between urban and rural areas or large areas where the connectivity is needed to enable the use cases that we started with. Yuka or Muriel, you want to comment on that? And then I'm going to go to audience Q&A. But any thoughts on that in terms of 5G becoming one of those enablers to just connect rural, urban? We'll go to Yuka and then Muriel will go to you.
Right. I think that's a great point. And I think it just brief comment on the Olympic 2021. I've been hearing a lot of, well, the Japanese 5G, all the four telecom operators have launched a certain kind of 5G, although the areas are still limited. Seems like lots of comments from the consumer side, on the user side, especially the smartphone, because 5G is more about how the application side, they haven't really been positive about their user experience yet. So I think this Tokyo Olympic, if it happened, I hope it happens, but would be an interesting case to see diverse different kind of applications or different kind of experience on the citizen side. And in terms of the continuation of the urban experience in the real network, I think that's a great point. And just looking even from the policy side, when the government decided to allocate spectrums and to these operators, the Japanese government have introduced a different kind of measurement. Previously, they were looking at how much the population is covered by the base station provided by these operators, but now they've kind of changed it to more on the geographical kind of criteria on how much it covers. So I think because this has industrial applications, not just about smartphone and not about how many people are connected in the urban space. I think I do agree with you and share your view that it's an inclusive technology.
Yes, Muriel?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to make two separate points. So I think that a lot of these are not only technology. I mean, in the U.S. in particular, as you recall, that there was a movement to having a lot of municipal fiber companies, and that was shut down. And that was shut down by very heavy lobbying of incumbent companies, not at the federal level, which would be too expensive, but on a state by state. Okay. So part of it is just that was by design, not necessarily by necessity. I mean, not to say that technology can't help, by all means, of course, that's what we do. But I want to also separate, looking at the status and saying, well, that's because of technological reasons, and looking at the status and realizing what's not for technological reasons. With respect to the user experience that Yuka mentioned, I was very happy you brought that up. Remember at the very beginning, I talked about desiderata, okay? And people often think of bandwidth, and particularly providing more allocation of spectrum, as providing better speed. It is a very wasteful way of providing better speed. And for a lot of applications, and I'll basically talk about gaming, but I want you to think of gaming writ large, all, AR, all virtual reality, augmented reality, virtual reality, basically where you may not actually have a huge number of a large amount of data going through. It's just that you want it very quickly and at the right time. Okay, that is not a matter of just throwing more bandwidth necessarily. That's one way of getting it, but it's massively wasteful of what is in effect a social good, which is the bandwidth. Again, currently, since the incumbents are trying to sell equipment, they're not particularly incentivized to do anything other than sell more equipment. And I think we really need to realize again that the engineering reality. There are many technologies out there which have been shown that what they would do is basically require far less infrastructure. By again, these are things that are happening by having coding and other things done. So, why, going back to that umbilical relation between traditional service providers and traditional equipment providers, and again, don't get me wrong, they do some fantastic stuff, but that's not the correct incentivization, and that's the way it is in terms of the engineering.
No, I totally agree with that. I think I've spoken about that as well. It's like we have to look at 5G technologies. And I think all of you have said this, and I'm going to go to a couple of questions in our remaining time. But we have to look at 5G technology, not just for the commercial, experiences that people want, how quickly you can download a movie, how fast. But if you just go back to Tokyo 2021, if by chance the vaccination doesn't make it safe enough, I'm just putting this out there, my fingers are crossed, to travel, imagine the use of the technology can actually enable the games where people can experience those all over the world. Imagine the extent to which young people who may not have the abilities to actually become a track and field runner can put in an AR, VR headset and actually experience the runner that is making it to the second or the third aspect of the finish line. To me, those are the exciting applications of 5G because it allows us to repurpose and retransform how we actually conduct day-to-day services. And it becomes a critical infrastructure. And that's what the pandemic, as Elsa sort of talked about, has showed us. We need more critical infrastructure to be able to get the work done, and internationally in a way that is very cooperative and collaborative. Now, not to throw a monkey wrench into your thinking, because all we've been talking about is 5G. Lino Vivas has asked a question about 6G. And so he mentioned, and I'll throw it out to anybody, what are the limitations of 5G that 6G will address? And so whoever would like to answer Lino's question, and thank you, Lino, for participating, the floor is yours. Go ahead, Muriel.
I can take a first stab just because I've been participating in some of those discussions. Again, I think it depends what you mean by 5G. I think to a large extent, we have, a lot of our discussion even here has really centered around what the formal definition. And, the fact is that the adoption has been by all accounts slower. While at the same time, because of the pandemic, we have all been online massively more, and it has become more, again, through Wi-Fi, a lot of software-defined networking happening. So in the wireline systems, you see more of the software-defined networking happening and really taking place. It's, there's been, as I said, a lot of push to not doing that. But for reasonable commercial reasons. I mean, probably these are companies. They need to be they need to be responsive to their shareholders. But the discussions around 6G, I think, are really looking at, in a way, really achieving those 5G desiderata, and I think that. I was recently on a panel with some wonderful people, including Larry Peterson from Oran. A lot of people think that basically, eventually, you are going to have interoperability. Again, a lot of pushback, a lot of not doing it from companies, but you are going to have that interoperability, and then you're going to have true virtualization and services. So I think that's really what 6G is coming. We haven't talked about machine learning and AI. I sort of thought it would pop up, but to some extent right now, if I had just a fantastic set of machine learning algorithms that could figure out all the little pieces of spectrum that are out there that I could use, what would I do about it anyway?
Right. You'd create 10G.
Well, I mean, it's like, you can tell me about all the opportunities I'm missing. You can give me fantastic algorithms, but because we haven't allowed the true heterogeneous access, if anything, again, their entrenched interests for not doing it, right?
Yeah.
What am I going to do about it, right? And so I think that maybe 6G to some extent is to say, well, okay, in this version of G, we were still working sort of because we need, the old amortization schedule of telecoms equipment, but maybe that's where it will really happen. I don't know.
No. Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think for everybody that's listening on behalf of the Japan Society, we also have to remember, I'm writing a book actually on the U.S. digital divide, which has some influence from my international experiences. There's some people who have, 5G. It's very scanty in the United States. It's people who are still mostly on 4G LTE, 3G, 2G, and then there's some people who have no Gs that live in communities where there is no penetration of wireless access. So I do agree with you. And I think as we have this conversation, really understanding the heterogeneity of the network, but also understanding that how we define it also becomes an entryway for the connectivity is really important. I want to ask this question, and this is to anybody. Zachary would like to know more specifically how 5G could be weaponized economically and militarily, and what are several anticipated potential outcomes. So Zachary wants to know, what are the specifics in terms of 5G's weaponization economically and militarily? Elsa, Yuka, would one of you like to respond, or Kazuo?
Sure, I'd be happy to speak to some of the military applications under consideration. I think in terms of the weaponization, we've discussed the risks of attacks on critical infrastructure that could be devastating, and ways in which that kind of network access could be exploited in a geopolitical flashpoint, for instance. But I think one interesting dimension of the conversation on 5G has been ways in which we're seeing multiple militaries around the world start to become more enthused about the benefits of leveraging that high speed and increased connectivity for defense applications. And this is something that I actually saw the Chinese military be among the first to start to explore in earnest. And a lot of this can be viewed in the context of China's national strategy of military civil fusion and efforts to try to promote dual use developments and collaborations between the military and industry with an aim to starting to leverage commercial advancements within military networks. And in some respects, the applications the militaries are exploring are adaptations of those we'll also see in entering commercial employment. So for instance, a 5G-enabled virtual reality can be used for training. And the U.S. military is exploring this. I think we'll expect multiple militaries to see this as an important technique going forward as well. Some of the practical applications of 5G in logistics, for instance, and enabling with greater sensors and the capacity to have better visibility, whether in sort of more mundane day-to-day operations or on a future battlefield, that could be quite consequential as well. And I think another aspect of that's starting to generate a lot of initial exploration would be how 5G could enhance command and control going forward, and what the Chinese military would call informatization, or the development essentially of command information systems. If you're able to upgrade beyond today's legacy architectures and start to bring 5G into the mix, that is terribly consequential when it comes to more distributed approaches to command and control, as well as the potential to realize IoT on the battlefield, or applications of AI going forward in operational environment as well. So this is something where the Department of Defense is within the United States is starting to engage in more extensive experimentation, including at a number of bases and test facilities. So it'll be interesting to see where this goes. And I think it does highlight that 5G really is a general purpose technology. So it's hardly surprising to see that that militaries would find such increased connectivity appealing as well, especially in an era where data and the capacity to leverage information, whether for situational awareness or command decision making, is viewed as a really critical competency for the future battlefield. And while some of this may be more nascent in other respects, starting to incorporate 5G into a military communications architecture, I think, is a application we can expect to see, whether in more localized environments, or through or against the backdrop of the continued expansion of national infrastructure going forward.
Yeah.
And I think the U.S. military is also, I think, does face concerns when it thinks about the challenge of global communications and the ways in which Huawei's presence in those networks that it depends upon for global protection of power could introduce sources of disruption in a crisis or conflict scenario.
Yeah. So we got time. Kazuo, you want to respond real quickly? We're coming up against our hour.
Oh, yes. Yeah, thank you so much. I totally agree that I was hearing DoD 7 or 600 million virtual reality. That's a really critical one. And but every digital equipment can be weaponized. So that was also discussed at the United Nations area. So 5G is kind of enabler for bad guys as well as good guys. So how we can utilize well the guidance as well as the sort of the safety net for good purpose for civilization. That's an important perspective going forward.
You know, I want to thank everybody. Oh, go ahead, Yuka. We're cutting up against the hour, so like 3 seconds before Josh comes on and kicks me off.
Just very quick comments, actually, about, so maybe from more from an economic perspective on why 5G security matters. I mean, like all networks, access, using untrusted network services will create some cybersecurity concerns, but the amount of data that flows in 5G is different. And I think that's the key from the economic security perspective, why the security matters so much. Like, I'm sure you've all heard of this word of data is like the oil of the 21st century. It's, the source of innovation and wealth. So probably that's why access to networks is such a concerning issue.
Yeah, no, thank you. First of all, I want to say thank you to everybody that participated in this discussion. This has been one of the most robust discussions that I've had in a long time around 5G technologies. Oftentimes, we're just talking about the infrastructure and the architecture. I think here, the combination of experts actually demonstrate just how important this topic is and how it's important to understand the different layering of that. Dan had a question just a moment ago about why am I seeing 5G on my phone versus 4G? Well, guess what, Dan? 5G is coming. It's not all there yet, but it's actually coming. Thank you to everyone for participating. Thank you to the Japan Society. Josh, I see you're back on. You want to say some closing remarks, but I appreciated the opportunity to serve humbly as your moderator this morning.
There's no need to be humble, Nicole. That was a great job. Thank you to all of our panelists. I feel like I've learned so much and all the different terms I hear often, but I don't know what they actually mean. You've really elucidated it for us. And I think it's really great that you've had this robust conversation in all aspects, including Tokyo Olympics, to see how this will affect our real lives. And as you all have pointed out, to see a global pandemic and see the importance of this geotechnology that you study. I hope this is a first of many conversations. So thank you, Nicole, for your job for moderating. Thank you, Muriel, Kazuo, Elsa, and Yuka, joining us from 4 corners of the earth. Thank you guys, and thank you, the viewers, for sticking with us. So we hope to continue to bring you more exciting developments from Japan Society, and thank you for making this a great morning start and the caffeine that we all have now from the ideas that are buzzing. Thank you again. Arigatou gozaimasu. Otsukaresama deshita.
Thank you.
Thanks.